Studies have shown that the diagnosis of anxiety in children and teenagers has gone from about 6% a little over 15 years ago to 12% in 2018 to 30% today in 2022. I see a lot of these anxious children and teenagers in my counseling practice, and sometimes their parents aren't sure how to know if their anxiety is kind of within a normal range or if it's problematic or above average. They're not always sure if it's anxiety that's the problem or if there's some other behavioral issue going on. And so I recently had the opportunity to do a workshop for parents to help them understand what to look for and how to better help their child. So we decided to split that workshop up into a series of videos for you, and we hope that you will find it helpful for your family.
As Karen said in her prayer, there's going to be a lot of situations obviously represented here tonight. We're talking about youth anxiety, so we're kind of spreading the gamut from children up through teenagers. So I want to make it clear from the outset, we're probably not going to have time to answer like every comprehensive question that you might have. But what I'm really hoping is to give you an overview so that maybe you know the right questions to ask, the right things to look for, the right places to dig when it comes to how to help your child. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of run through the agenda so you know like a little bit of roadmap of what is coming. You do have notes in front of you. But we're going to kind of look at definitions of anxiety, what it actually is, because sometimes people are confused. We hear medical diagnoses, we read about anxiety in scripture, and we go like, sometimes these things don't seem to mesh. How much of this is medical or physiological? How much is spiritual? Is it sin? There's a lot of areas that get really confusing for people when talking about definitions. So we're going to start there. Then we're going to look at some specific ways that it manifests in kids and teenagers that might be different than what you would expect or what you might see in an adult. And then I'm going to try to look at how can parents help? What can be your role? And hopefully equip you with some good information to, again, give you like the good starting point. So whenever I give talks on anxiety, I always like to give an anecdote about one of my children because their personalities are all unique, but unfortunately, they do all struggle with different levels of anxiety. So my oldest son, Lucas, he is a perfectionist, like one of those kids where everything has to be just right, and pressures himself academically, pressures himself in sports. And in his freshman year of high school, he had a huge anxiety attack that kind of led to a breakdown for him and ended up in counseling. He had this awesome arc all the way to senior year of a lot of growth and coping mechanisms. He was doing really, really well. But last week, I got to go see him graduate from basic training. So we thought, wow, what a great, this kid has come so far. He's in the military, what a great testimony it is. And so when we got there and we're talking to, the different people, meeting some of the soldiers, they all kept saying, Lucas asks so many questions. Does he have ADD? Does he have anxiety? Like, what is wrong with him? He's constantly asking questions. And it sort of became a joke. And we talked to his drill sergeant a little bit, and sure enough, as we talked with Lucas, he said, yes, I realized that when I was at home, I had all of these coping skills that I had set up, and I thought everything was great because I've got my systems in place, and I've got my music, and I've got my noise-canceling earphones, and I know my routine. I can have alone time when I need it. But when I got here, I didn't have any of those things. There's no time to be alone. There's no music. There's very little that he was accustomed to using to cope. And so asking questions was his manifestation of anxiety. I've got to know what's going to happen, what's expected of me, if I'm going to get in trouble. He's asking all these questions. And so I wanted to kind of open up by sharing that because I have a funny picture. This is Lucas's drill sergeant, and the look that he was giving him when he was talking about all the questions Lucas asks. So that was one of our takeaways was poor Lucas, his reputation. And when we left, the drill sergeant was saying, please, get him away, and Lucas kept saying, but one last question. So it ended up being a really cute thing, but an example of how sometimes that can show up in our lives. So I want to start with the definition, as I said. What is anxiety? And like everything, I believe that a proper understanding of anxiety actually begins with a proper understanding of God. That's your first blank on your outline there. A proper understanding of anxiety begins with a proper understanding of God. Colossians 1:16 says, "For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him." So we know that God is the creator of all things. He's the creator of our minds, of our bodies, our brains. The next scripture there, Nahum 1:7, "The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust in him." So those are two things we can know about God in the context of looking at anxiety. He is the creator of our bodies, and simultaneously, he's good, right? When we think of anxiety, we tend to think of the negative component of that. But at its foundational level, anxiety is a physiological response. And it's made by God for our protection. So if you look at number 3 there, its purpose is protection and wisdom. But like all things, our bodies are subject to the fall. They're subject to sin. So we're going to look at the diagram of the brain here and kind of discuss how anxiety works and why God made it. So when you look at where it's marked the hippocampus, when I'm working with kids, we use the hand, and we talk about the hand as the model of our brain. So the hippocampus is your fight, flight, freeze center, and I'm sure that you've heard about that, fight, flight, or freeze. And the actual purpose of it is to protect you. But it's activated by both real danger and perceived danger. So whenever you believe that something is going to be scary, you get that little catch in your throat, or your heart rate escalates a little bit. It's the protective mechanism that makes us run after our kids when they run out into the street, right? We want to go, don't do that, or, don't touch the stove. That's your fight, flight, or freeze response being activated that makes you do that. So God put it there on purpose in order to protect us, to help us to walk in wisdom. So when that goes off, it releases adrenaline into your system so that you can act quickly. But as the adrenaline is released, depending on the level of anxiety, it floods up to the prefrontal cortex. So it's connected there to your brainstem. It goes down into the limbic system. We get that bodily response. Our face flushes, or our heart starts to beat a little bit faster. Some people stiffen. Some people feel energetic. Anger and anxiety actually cause the same response. So when we're working with kids, sometimes we have to differentiate that because your body will do the same thing. But it floods that system with adrenaline, and then if the danger is sustained, then it also gives you cortisol, the stress hormone. So it acts quickly, but because it floods the prefrontal cortex, it sometimes prevents you from thinking logically. So depending on how anxious you are, the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain where we do math and logic and reasoning. We have to be pretty calm in order to access that part of our brain. So the more triggered we are, the more flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, the less clearly we can think. So we're not always sure in that moment what is true. So we can see that the system that God designed to protect us sometimes goes a little bit haywire. We're going to talk in a minute about some of the things that can cause that to happen. But because it's subject to the fall, right, sometimes it goes haywire and it doesn't necessarily operate in alignment with, your next point here, God's ideal design. Anxiety's purpose can become out of alignment with God's ideal design. It can grow into a way of thinking, feeling, and being. And when we use the word anxiety culturally, it's usually this that we're referring to. Not that just physical response of our body. We're usually referring to someone who is anxious, who struggles with anxiety, who has anxiety. And then that last point on this section, God calls us to walk in wisdom, but not in fear. So this is where some of the discrepancies come for believers in understanding anxiety, is that when we read the Proverbs, for example, or some parts of the New Testament, we get so much wisdom for how to live our lives, right? Principles of sowing and reaping, work and rest, and God calls us to walk in wisdom. But then we also see that it says things like, do not fear, because the Lord your God is with you, right? Or to take courage, to take heart. Philippians 4 is my favorite anxiety passage. We're going to look at that at the end, but it says, be anxious for nothing. And I've had people come into my office and say, because I feel anxious, God must be disappointed with me. God's unhappy with me. I'm sinning because I just feel anxious all the time. And they have trouble distinguishing kind of that line of demarcation where I've moved out of the realm of actually the design that God had for how my body's supposed to operate. And now I've moved into sort of letting anxiety spiral or take over, or the things that I'm anxious about have become an idol. I'm struggling now to trust God. So healing from anxiety does not mean getting rid of it. It means learning to diagnose it, learning to say, what is it there for?